Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Zach Drew.
And I am Josh Peck. How you doing?
I am doing well. Today's interview, I really am excited about.
Yeah, me too.
I was even telling you, I like all the shows, I like all the interviews, but today there's just something about it that I think the people need to hear. Mm-hmm. We have such an amazing guest with us here on today's program, Timothy Alberino. Timothy Alberino is the author of the groundbreaking book, Birthright, and has appeared on numerous television and radio programs. He's an authoritative speaker and researcher on many topics, including alternative history, giants, UFOs, and alien abduction, occult conspiracy, and Christian eschatology. Mr. Timothy Alberino, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Zach and Josh, for having me on. Looking forward to our discussion.
Me too.
Absolutely,
and
us too.
Like I told you before we started, don't hesitate to speak your mind, my friend.
I never do.
There we go. Hey, I love it. That's how we ought to all be. We're going to get into it a little bit today, but just letting the audience know, Timothy Alberino has been contacted by certain congressmen recently. He's been invited to come out to D.C. to actually sit down with several sitting members of Congress. On today's program, he is going to be sharing some behind-the-scenes information. And what's interesting is that D.C. is actually flying him in because these congresspeople, they want to know his theological views concerning ETs, concerning extraterrestrials. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you actually were even just recently invited to be a speaker at the National Republican Breakfast this year in D.C.
Not yet, not exactly.
Okay.
I've been in conversation with one particular congressman from the UAP hearing committee.
And they'd like for you to.
This gentleman is, he's a Christian, very intelligent guy, and I've spoken on the phone with him on several occasions and met with him. And he and his colleagues are fighting a very intense battle right now behind the scenes to try and get David Grush, the whistleblower from the intelligence community, in a SCIF in that secure location where he can be thoroughly debriefed about what he knows, and obviously give them the information that he talked about during the hearing, including the location of these recovered UFOs, these recovered advanced aerospace vehicles, non-human advanced aerospace vehicles. So no, I haven't been actually invited anywhere. There's talks happening behind the scenes, but there's been no formal invitation. But I have been in conversation with one of the congressmen.
So I have something here I want to talk about before we even get into the interview. This was breaking recently, and I think that you have some thoughts on this. There are now reports coming from Mexico, Peru, and other nations that are revealing how they have recovered the bodies of aliens. I actually went on Drudge Report. It's one of the featured stories this morning, and how there's going to be so many more to follow. They're boasting how this nullifies the Bible and turns Christianity on its head. And I think there's radical deception coming. But what are your thoughts on what's taking place in Mexico right now concerning these aliens? And before that, I want to share just the two articles as well. So one article says two alleged non-human alien corpses were unveiled during a public hearing in Mexico's Congress. Also, another one says, this is from Independent, alien corpses shown to Congress as UFO expert forced to testify under oath.
Well, I'm always cautious about anything that comes out of Mexico.
Yeah.
There's been too many hoaxes in the past. There's been, alleged creatures that have turned out to be composites of other kinds of animal life. And so these particular beings that they presented during their hearings in Mexico, I don't know what to make of them right now. I do have an interesting story in Peru, though. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I've for people who know me and my work, I've spent a lot of time in Peru. I lived there for a decade. I was working on a project in Peru a few years ago, and one of the archaeologists that were working on our team, he was a Spanish fellow who was doing archaeology in Peru, and he was associated with a French explorer. And it was this French explorer who originally discovered some of these mummies. I don't know if it's the same mummies that we've seen in these hearings in Mexico. So I think it is one of the ones that was featured on the Gaia TV, that documentary, if you guys remember that one, the three long fingers and that mummy. And I had assumed that those were fake because of the way that they were presented and because of the fact that the content went over to Gaia TV and not National Geographic or something like that. I had always assumed they were fake, and I was actually standing at the Chongos Pyramid in the desert of Paracas in Peru and talking to this archaeologist friend of mine, and he was discussing some of the projects he had worked on, and he made it explicitly clear to me that he did not want to talk about anything related to aliens. He did not want to, if we were going to talk about aliens or UFOs, he did not want to be involved. He didn't want his face to be on camera because he had some trouble in a previous project related to aliens. And I assured him that that current episode we were filming had nothing to do with aliens. And I inquired as to what the project was that he was working on. And he said that he was involved in that recovery, in that situation with those alleged alien bodies from Peru. And this was a very skeptical archaeologist. He doesn't really believe in any of the kind of stuff that I talk about. He's just a very straight edge archaeologist. And I was shocked to discover when I asked him if those bodies were fake, he said, actually, no. He said they were DNA tested by like a dozen labs. They were X-rayed by a bunch of different labs. He said they were absolutely shocked to find out that these things were real. And he began to tell me a bunch of stories related to the recovery and examination of these beings. They were mummified. Some were found in caves. These ones were in a mine in Peru, the ones that Jaime Maussan unveiled in Mexico. And they were preserved, mummified in the fashion that some of the natives were mummified in, the Nazca people and the Paracas people. Nazca and Paracas, it's in the region of Ica, and it's a very mysterious, it's near the region of Ica, Paracas, and then Nazca. That whole region there in Peru is very mysterious, very, very strange place. Believe me, I've spent a lot of time there. Intense desert, nothing decays out there. You can go into the desert over there and pick up cloth off the ground from the Paracas civilization, which we did. Burial cloth, that shirts and different kinds of mantles that are still intact after thousands of years. That's how arid it is in that desert. In fact, it never rains. It's one of the driest places on earth. Interesting side note, when we were there, it actually poured one day. And it was a phenomenon that hadn't happened in decades. And it happened to rain while we were there, which was very strange. So it's the kind of environment that you would expect to find mummified creatures of all kinds. And but anyway, my archaeologist, the guy on our team, was very he was surprised. He was shocked at what they discovered with these mummies. He said that they were visited by members of the intelligence community. He said that he thinks that there was an attempt to poison him. And the other guy he was working with, he had this whole long, crazy story associated with these things. Ultimately, they ended up dumping them off to Gaia. They were going to do like this documentary and everything, and they were in discussion with all different TV networks and this. And then I forget why, but it was just such a hassle, such a problem. They ended up just dumping it off to Gaia, and I think Jaime Maussan got his hands on them after a while. So, having said that, I don't know what to think about these things. As I said earlier, I'm very slow to believe anything like this coming out of Mexico or Central America in general and South America, because there's just too much tomfoolery happening in those countries in regard to these kinds of things. They get a lot of attention, and it's not as difficult as people might think to hoax these kinds of creatures. You can make composite, and we've seen this before, where there's allegedly fantastical creatures, fairies and little gnomes and things like this that end up being composites of various kinds of animals that are literally super glued together. So the jury's out with this thing. If it weren't Jaime Maussan, if it was a group of credentialed researchers who were bringing this forward, or government people in Mexico, I might be inclined to believe it a little bit more. So the jury's out. I don't know. That's my long-winded answer. I have no idea what to make of those bodies.
Okay. So just to let my audience know, a couple of questions on today's program I'm going to be asking Timothy is, does he believe that our government, or any government for that matter, is in contact with otherworldly beings right now, and to what capacity? Also, how does the alien question tie in with Bible prophecy? But Timothy, let me ask you this real quick. Do you believe, it seems like, because I do believe in portals. I believe that it seems like there's locations across the planet that are much more spiritual, much more sensitive to ET activity, to, whether you want to call it, and this is a point of contention for a lot of people, who to make. I know that you're on one side and other people are on the other side. Is it aliens? Is it fallen angels? Is it both? Do you believe that there are certain areas throughout the world that basically act as portals, and that is why there is such heightened activity there as opposed to everywhere throughout the world? What are your thoughts on it?
I suspect that there might be, but I think maybe in some cases we're probably talking about bases, not portals, or bases in which there are portals. I think that there are non-human bases under the earth, especially under the ocean, and that in these areas you're going to naturally have much more activity, UFO activity, because you're going to have these craft coming in and out of the bases.
What do you mean base? What do you mean base?
Well, we have our own deep underground military bases in the United States. We also have undersea bases, submarine bases. The Nazis had bases under Antarctica. So we have our bases, but then there are bases that are not ours. We know that there are locations where there seem to be non-human, let's call them alien bases. And around these alien bases, you have a lot of UFO activity. You have, just like you would have a lot of military presence around an army base, you have a lot of anomalous activity around these suspected alien bases. And so I absolutely believe that those exist. I do believe that there is an alien presence on planet Earth, and to some extent has been since the conception of mankind. We can get into that. But specifically, I think that we are dealing with a particular faction for much of the sightings, certainly most of the crash retrievals, that our government has been for decades retrieving alien craft that has crashed in various parts of the United States and all around the world, and has been attempting to reverse engineer that technology with some degree of success, but not total success, and in fact has been recovering, as David Grush calls it, biologics, non-human biologics, or alien bodies associated with these craft. And I think that those bodies are probably mostly associated with the gray alien faction. So I would say unequivocally that there is an alien presence on Earth, and that sort of relates to your second question in regard to the biblical narrative.
Before we get to that, for those who may not be familiar, in late 2017, the Pentagon released some distressing footage that really brought the UFO question to the forefront. What was that footage, and why was it so important?
Well, that was the Nimitz incident, and it was a tic-tac shaped object that Commander David Fravor saw, and it was while he was piloting an 118 Hornet, Super Hornet jet, and he captured this object on the gunship camera, and they tracked it. It was moving at incredible speeds, and it was demonstrating capabilities that were clearly not, let's say, not human, that were clearly far more advanced than anything that we have in any sort of military or Air Force assets that we have. That 2017, and by the way, the New York Times published that. They leaked that. It was leaked to them, and then they published an article featuring that video. And then that snowballed into a series of other releases of footage from the Pentagon, and those were official releases. So the Pentagon confirmed the veracity of the Tic Tac footage, and then subsequently released some other footage. And this began really, I would say, this slow roll of disclosure that we're seeing now. And that's really when things kicked off, was in 2017. So it was the events of 2017 and then some other things that came out subsequent to that New York Times article, crescendoing with David Grush's testimony, rather his interview on News Nation, which then crescendoed into the UAP hearing that happened a couple of months ago, or last month, I don't remember at this point, which was unprecedented, almost nearly unprecedented. We had something like it back, I believe, in the 60s. But this hearing really was unprecedented in regard to what was disclosed, because David Grush has said under oath unequivocally that the United States, elements of the United States government, let's be more specific, elements of the Pentagon with certain aerospace Defense Department contractors have been recovering alien spacecraft, as he calls them, that were crash retrievals and non-human entities associated with them.
Do you believe the individuals that were speaking in that congressional hearing, do you believe that they were credible?
So I assume you're referring to David Grush, David
Right.
Fravor, and Ryan Graves. Well, there's no question that David Fravor and Ryan Graves are credible. These guys are decorated Navy pilots. They're highly praised by their compatriots in the Navy, and they simply witnessed UFO activity. So they just came forward and gave testimony in regard to what they personally witnessed during training exercises. They've encountered these craft, and their testimony was, one of the congressmen asked them point blank, "Is there any chance whatsoever that the craft that you guys have seen on these training exercises could belong to Russia or China or any other nation?" And they said, "Absolutely not." And then David Grush is kind of a caliber above them, because he was a former military intelligence officer for the Air Force, and he was actually working with the AARO, the Pentagon's Office for Investigating Anomalous Activity. It's basically their UFO investigative arm at the Pentagon that was recently created, and he's working directly with them from the intelligence community. And he was coming up against, during the course of his investigation, he was coming up against a special access program that he was not read into, and that program related to the recovery of alien crash retrievals. And he hit this wall, and his job is to investigate, right? And he's a high-level intelligence officer. His job is to investigate this phenomenon. And so he hits this wall of secrecy during this investigation, and he is not allowed to know anything about it. He's not read into it. And in fact, not only is he not being read into it, but he begins to receive threats from one of the private contractors, one of the presumably aerospace or perhaps security contractors working on these projects, and threats to his life, threats to his family. And He was being harassed, and I think he was afraid. He has said as much, actually, on the interviews and hearings and during the hearings. And so he did something that I think I would have done, and I think you guys would have done. He took advantage of a new whistleblower pathway that was only recently created for people blowing the whistle in regard to UFO content. And he did it in an environment that is taking the UFO phenomenon seriously. So, as opposed, for example, to Bob Lazar, who blew the whistle back in the 80s and early 90s, or rather early 90s, who was just laughed at by the media, except for George Knapp, of course. But Bob Lazar was just it was an unserious. It was an unserious news story. When Bob Lazar, it was an environment that was totally different than today. Today, the news is taking this issue very seriously, the media rather, and now you have a whistleblower pathway. And so the environment is different, and it allowed David Grush to come forward to receive some whistleblower protections and to be taken seriously by the media, which resulted in hearings at Congress. So the environment is different today than it used to be. And he did so. He came forward because he was being threatened and because of his personal frustration from hitting this secrecy wall. And what gave Grush the confidence to come forward was that he was able to obtain documentation that proves that these programs exist, these crash retrieval programs. And he received support from other very high-ranking members of the intelligence community, who he has named and some that he has not. So his confidence was bolstered by the fact that these other seasoned intelligence guys said, this is real. Mm-hmm. This is happening. We can confirm it. And he had documentation in hand to prove that it was real. And he was being threatened. So he comes forward. He actually, and what's the most remarkable thing about this story is he got cleared by the director. I'm forgetting the title. He was basically cleared by the Pentagon to an extent because of this whistleblower pathway that had been created. He was cleared to discuss some of this information with Congress, and not all of it, but the majority of what he has to say. The Inspector General, that's what I'm trying to say. He was cleared by the Inspector General of the intelligence community. That's what I was trying to say. And so he gave his proof to the Inspector General of the intelligence community, and then he gave his proof to some other individuals. And at this moment in time, and this I can confirm from my conversations with the congressman, in this moment in time, the Pentagon or the intelligence community or both are pushing back against Congress. In regard to getting David Grush in the skiff. They are fighting Congress. They're fighting the UAP committee. They don't want them to be able to interview David Grush in a secure location in a skiff so that Grush can literally give them the coordinates to where these crash retrievals are being housed in these special access programs, probably many of them in these in underground bases.
Now, and I know you can't name names. I understand that, and how you were recently contacted, and you have inside information of this as well. Is this the inside information?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I've been talking with one of the congressmen from the committee, and he discussed with me how the committee came to be, and expressed his frustration that they're getting pushback from, I would assume, from the Pentagon about getting the clearance, about getting Grush cleared to speak with them in that skiff. And remember, Grush isn't just going to come and tell them, "Hey guys, I've seen strange lights in the sky," something like that. No, he's got the goods. He's got the documentation. There were things that they tried to draw out of him, information, very important information that they tried to draw out of him during the hearing, that he kept saying, I can't comment on that in this public setting. That's something that I can disclose in a secure setting, but the Pentagon has to clear it.
So now that you have the attention of some of these people in Congress involved in this field, what are your future plans? What are you hoping to convince them of? And how do you plan to do it?
So my goal is to resource any of these congressmen that interact with me, to resource them with good material, with good research. Because as you guys, I'm sure, are well aware, there's a lot of really bad research in the field of ufology, especially the newer stuff. And there's bad actors in the field of ufology as well. And I would also add that there's probably disinfo agents from the intelligence community that are probably even speaking at some of these UFO conferences. I'm sure that's the case. So my goal is to help navigate these guys to the good research, to the individuals who I think are trustworthy, and really help give them ammunition for this battle, because this is one of the things I stressed to the congressman was, this is the adversaries that these guys are up against. And when I say these guys, I mean the committee members. And by the way, there are some committee members that are more serious than others. I think some of these congressmen, certainly not the one that I've been talking to, but some of these other congressmen are on the committee because it's FaceTime, it's TV time, right? It's, as my friend Richard Dolan said, it's what the cool kids are doing now in Congress. They're talking about UAPs. And so, you have some of that where it's just unserious folks on that committee, but you do have a core group of congressmen who are very serious about this issue, about this topic, and who want to continue to press deeper into it, to pop that lid off even more in regard to the disclosure of whatever's going on behind the scenes as it relates to these craft and these entities. And so my goal is to resource these guys and to try and orient them to the best research that I know of, to the best people in the field, and also to help orient them in regard to a biblical perspective, to help orient them in terms of the paradigm, to be able to accommodate what they're encountering within a biblical paradigm. And I was very pleased to discover that the core faction in Congress that is driving disclosure happened to be a bunch of Christian guys and gals. So, and very, very, very committed, serious believers. And they're actually the most enthusiastic about getting to the bottom of this stuff. And I found that to be quite encouraging. And so that's why there's this desire, I think, at this point. I think some of these guys are experiencing a little bit of ontological shock. They're sort of swooning with the reality that there are non-human biological entities involved in this phenomenon and that are in possession of advanced technology. And so, it's these guys, the work they're doing, especially these particular congressmen, the one that I'm talking with and his colleagues, what they're doing is admirable. And I would also add dangerous. And I told him, I said, there's probably high-ranking members of the intelligence community that would like nothing more than to put a bullet in your head.
And why is that? What is it about what they know? Because I'm assuming, you could talk about this too, that our government is, you probably believe that they are actually in contact, maybe even communicating with these ETs. And so what's the end game for them? Why are they trying to hide it if these things are actually happening?
Well, first and foremost, because of the technology.
Okay.
There is a legitimate let's be honest, there is a legitimate national security concern here.
Because people freak out? Because
we don't want to share the kind of technology that we've been able to derive from crash retrievals. We don't want to share that technology with Russia or China.
Okay.
We need to maintain a tactical advantage in regard to this technology. I get that. I think that's important. As an American citizen, I would rather that the United States government be in possession of this technology than China, let's say. So I understand that aspect of it. And that's, that might be the only reasonable excuse for keeping some of this secret. Outside of that, we run into some very nefarious stuff, including the fact that, we have been, we're concealing technology, for example, that would totally transform human society, could eliminate poverty. We're talking about free energy. So there's moneyed interests involved here that wouldn't want this kind of technology available to the public, which is, of course, nefarious. I mean, it would instantly catalyze the betterment of human civilization, especially in third world countries. So to me, that's part of the equation. But also, there's a lot of skeletons in this closet. When you talk about the decades long program that's been going on, the crash retrieval programs and cover up of the alien presence and of the whole UFO phenomenon. To put it in no uncertain terms, the government has killed people to keep this secret, more than a few, and and has ruined people's lives to keep this thing a secret. The government is covering up, and when I say the government, that I don't like that term. We talk about the deep state, and the deep state is this entrenched bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., involving the intelligence communities, involving the FBI, the CIA, involving, just the bureaucratic machine that never changes in Washington. You can change out the faces, the politicians, but you never change these individuals. They don't go anywhere. These are the real power players behind the scenes. In the military, there are certain generals who are so entrenched, especially the ones who are dealing with these special access programs. That's the deep state. But I think there's an even deeper deep state. I call it the dumb state. And it's sort of tongue in cheek. But dumb, of course, is the acronym for deep underground military bases. And that's where a lot of these special access programs are being developed, is in these deep underground military bases. And that's where some of the most nefarious things are taking place. And so I call it the dumb state. It's deeper than the deep state. It's the dumb state. And I believe that the skeletons in the closet in regard to the dumb state are I think if people knew what's been going on behind the scenes, they would be absolutely appalled to discover. For one thing, aside from the fact that they're hiding potentially beneficial technology from the rest of human society, they've been covering up the abduction phenomenon for decades. And the abduction phenomenon directly relates to American citizens. And the primary function of the United States government, especially the military and the intelligence communities, is to protect the American people, ostensibly, right? Although they haven't really been doing that great of a job. But that's one of the primary functions of government. And the subject of alien abductions reveals that not only has the government not only been protecting American citizens, but the government itself, and again, let's be more specific, the dumb state has been to some extent complicit in the abduction phenomenon, in that they have not told us, they've not warned us about this threat, about this ongoing phenomenon in which hundreds of thousands of Americans are involved involuntarily. In other words, the Greys are using the wombs of our females to incubate their human hybrid clones.
You got to understand, my audience and your audience, I don't know how much overlap there is. So what you just said was absolutely fascinating and terrifying. just pretend like this is a 101 class. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have been abducted, and they're placing clones within their wombs, and these terrestrial celestial beings are walking amongst us.
Well, yes, and this, and this is, again, this is one of the nefarious things. This is one of the skeletons in the closet that certainly the Pentagon does not want to talk about, is alien abductions, because they're directly implicit in the cover-up. They haven't done anything to protect the American people from it. They certainly haven't told us about it. And I think that I actually believe in the Eisenhower agreement that was struck between the Eisenhower administration and gray aliens. As crazy as that sounds, there's a lot of good ufologists, the best ufologists, in fact, who believe that story is true because of all of the corroborating evidence surrounding that crazy story. And so if it is indeed true that elements of the government have struck a deal, we get technology, we permit you to abduct our citizens, that's treasonous against the American people.
Man.
So circling back around to the abduction phenomenon itself, when you talk about alien abductions, this is an area of inquiry. This is an area of research in ufology that lends itself to scientific inquiry, because it is a body of evidence. The abduction phenomenon there's a body of evidence, definitive evidence, that this phenomenon is real, it's physical, and every kind of evidence, every kind of proof that you would bring to bear in a court of law to prove a case, you can find within the abduction phenomenon and within the research that's been done over the decades by highly competent researchers. Some of the best ufologists, such as in the beginning, it was John Mack sort of cracked the lid on this thing. The Harvard psychologist John Mack, who I believe was killed. Then you had, of course, the late Carla Turner. You have Bud Hopkins, and you have David Jacobs. Those are the individuals. And of course, David Jacobs he's retired now, but he was a professor of history at Temple University. Dr. Carla Turner was a highly credentialed professor, university professor. Bud Hopkins was a phenomenal field investigator. If you read any of Bud Hopkins' work, very intelligent man, just a great, old school field investigator. And of course, John Mack, who was the professor of psychology, I believe he was psychology, the professor of psychology at Harvard.
Jeez.
And so you have this body of evidence that's been compiled primarily by them, but there's been some others in the mix as well, other highly competent researchers. And this body of evidence that they've been able to compile is conclusive. And most of this work was done 70s, 80s, 90s. It's conclusive. Alien abductions are a physical phenomenon. People are physically taken from whatever environment they happen to be in during an abduction episode. Many times it's a bedroom. Sometimes they're laying on the couch. Sometimes they're camping. They're in a camper in the woods. Sometimes they're driving their cars. Actually, quite often they're abducted as they're driving a car down the road at nighttime. They're taken by, usually in almost every case, by the little gray aliens. They're brought on board an alien craft, and they're subjected to not experiments. They're subjected to a very methodical, systematic procedure that is related to the production of human-alien hybrids. Sperm is extracted from the males and other genetic material, and women have, let's say, gynecological procedures performed on them, and oftentimes women have these zygotes implanted into their wombs, which grow into fetuses, which are extracted around the 3-month period before they begin to show. And so in a subsequent abduction, they're abducted again, and then the fetuses, the hybrid fetuses are extracted, and they finish their development in gestation tanks until they're, and when they're toddlers, by the way, these women interact with their hybrid offspring. And it's very complicated. phenomenon, but unfortunately, it's very real. And so that is, circling all the way back to the hearings, that is one of the topics that I can guarantee you that the Pentagon does not want
my goodness.
brought up.
So, one of the men I respect more than anybody else on this planet, he's gone to be with the Lord now, was Dr. Chuck Missler.
Yes.
And I was on several programs with him, and I had the opportunity to have dinner with him several different times. And he was the first person that I had ever heard even discuss this matter. And I remember one point that he said to me is that so many of these women do not appear to be attention seeking. The vast majority of them have zero psychiatric history. They're not looking for the spotlight. It's just a fact of the matter that they're discussing what took place with them.
Yeah. The abduction phenomenon is cross-cultural. It happens all over the world, and it cuts across society. In other words, you have blue-collar guys and gals that are being abducted. You have white-collar guys and gals, CEOs of big companies. You have congressmen and women who are being abducted. You have doctors and psychiatrists, and it's a cross-section of human society.
What are they doing with the babies?
Denominator.
Oh yeah, keep going.
I was just going to say that the common denominator in the abduction phenomenon, in regard to who's being abducted, is family lines. So abductions happen within it's hereditary. So if your parents are abductees, then you also are going to be an abductee. So that's the one thing that abduction researchers have been able to identify in terms of commonality in the phenomenon is it is hereditary.
Why is that?
I'm sorry?
Why?
Well, nobody really knows. I suspect it's my theory that this gets complicated, but I believe that the human species is inherently, at the beginning of this program, you told me that I can say whatever I want, so here we go.
There you go.
I believe that the human species is inherently telepathic. I think that telepathy is the primary mode of communication for highly intelligent beings. I think that angels are telepathic. I think there's a lot of evidence for that, and that's our primary was our primary mode of communication, and so and with that, we might call that and not. I'm not a New Age guy. I don't subscribe to the New Age whatsoever. But I do believe that there are certain, let's call them psychic capacities that the human species used to possess that we've lost because of genetic degeneration. We were much more remarkable beings than we are presently. Adam was a much more remarkable human being than we are. We are really crappy copies of Adam because of genetic degeneration. So I think Adam and Eve had incredible, remarkable capabilities that we've lost, including telepathy. And I think that some of those, let's call them psychic capabilities that were innate in the human species, are more active still, even though we're all broken down versions of Adam and Eve, are more active in certain family lines. And that would be because it would be a genetic thing. So, and those family lines are preferred for abduction because it makes for a more facile abductee. In other words, part of the control of the Greys over the human species is a telepathic control. And so if you're interacting with human beings who are more susceptible to telepathic control, then it makes your job easier. Communicating with them, telepathically controlling them, installing into their minds the screen memories that block the real memories of the abduction episodes. That's why most abductees can't remember abduction episodes. So you are a much more practical individual to work with if you have if you're, let's say your psychic capacity is more enhanced than other human beings. And that would be, again, that would be genetic. And if it is genetic, then that sort of confirms my theory that Adam and Eve were in possession of some of these remarkable capabilities, and innately. So that would be one of the potential reasons why certain family lines are chosen for abduction. That their psychic capacities, their psychic capabilities are heightened, are more activated. Let's put it in a more accurate way. I think it would be more accurate to say that they're less degenerated in their psychic capabilities than the rest of us, and that makes them easier. It makes them facile abductees. It makes them easier to control. That is, and to communicate with. That is my theory, and the reason why, one of the reasons why I've come to this belief, is because if you study the abduction material, you will discover that apparently the Greys are using psychics to identify new potential abductees.
Say that again?
That the Greys are utilizing psychics to identify potential abductees. And that comes from some of Carla Turner's material. A lot of psychics happen to be, I'm talking about your neighborhood psychic. You don't see a whole lot of them anymore. By the way, I do not condone going to a psychic. In fact, especially in light of the abduction phenomenon, I would say stay clear away from psychics. But, and I do not condone trying to contact the dead and all of that. That's not the kind of, when I say psychic, innate psychic abilities, I'm not talking about witchcraft and contacting the dead and all of that. That's prohibited in the Bible. I'm talking about being able to communicate telepathically, having a much more powerful empathic connection with other human beings. That's what I'm talking about. And so you'll discover in the abduction material that a lot of your neighborhood psychics are abductees. And are being used to inadvertently.
Oh my goodness!
Inadvertently used. I mean, rather, they're being used directly by the Greys, but they have no knowledge of the fact that they're being used to identify other potential abductees. And it makes sense if the Greys are looking for people who are readily disposed or predisposed to psychic control.
Timothy, hundreds of thousands of abductions. You said that's an army. Where are they? Where are they? Are they walking amongst us? Is it Joe Biden? I mean, do they look like us? Do they talk like us? I mean, like.
Well, sure. I mean, abductees come from every walk of life. They're your neighbors. Like I said, it might be your doctor. It might be your congressman.
But the product of it, the babies. Where do those babies go?
Oh, the hybrids.
And are they walking amongst us?
I believe they are. I think that the purpose of the abduction program is to progenerate human alien hybrids that are for all intents and purposes indistinguishable from the rest of us.
So quite literally, just to make this a point, some of our sitting congressmen, I mean, we wouldn't have an idea of who these beings are that are partially human, partially not, correct?
No, I don't know how high up the echelon these hybrids have climbed in terms of, if they're sitting members of Congress at this point. I would say that's probably unlikely, and the reason why I think that is because David Jacobs did a lot. Dr. David Jacobs did a lot of good research into this topic, and he wrote a book. His last book was called "Walking Among Us," which was his final published material in regard to the abduction phenomenon. And in that book, Jacob zeroes in on this, what he calls hybrids, human alien hybrids, advanced human alien hybrids. He calls them hybrids. And because he's been interfacing with thousands of abductees over his career. And again, his career wasn't an abduction researcher. His career was a history professor at Temple University. The abduction stuff was sort of his hobby. And
wow.
And he discovered that a lot of the abductees were being forced to interact with these advanced human alien hybrids. And their job, the abductees' job, was to introduce the hybrid into human society and to teach them how to operate, how to function in human society without looking too abnormal. So they were teaching them to, how do you use a television? What do you do with a refrigerator? How do you go to Walmart and buy things? How do you check out? How do you check out at the grocery store? How do you, how do you look? How do you operate in society to where you're not drawing attention to yourself? That's basically what was going on. And that was some years ago. I think that book was released in, I want to say 2016. I'm looking at my bookshelf. I don't remember. It was some years ago. And so let's assume that's true, that there are human alien hybrids walking among us, and that some of these abductees are having to sort of introduce them into human society and teach them the basics of living in society. Then it would seem unlikely then that those human alien hybrids who are learning how to use a refrigerator are now in Congress, or are now the presidents of universities or something like that.
Well, then again, everything you just described, how to function in society, how to walk, open a refrigerator, I mean, God, it just sounds like Joe Biden, but
touche.
Yeah.
Where do you see this go? I mean, it makes a lot of sense why the deep state or the dumb state, don't want this out, but it is still getting out. I remember a few years ago, even before 2017, years ago, you predicted that if we ever get official disclosure, that it would likely be a slow or a soft disclosure. And we're certainly seeing that happen now. Do you think it'll continue like that? Like, what do you think the next few years look like in terms of disclosure and this information getting out? Maybe not to the extent of, hybrids walking among us. Maybe that'll take longer to be public knowledge. But I mean, even just the existence of UFOs or now UAPs, where do you see the next few years taking us?
Well, I think that the next important step in disclosure, as it pertains, we should back up and say that the Pentagon has a problem. And I'm using the Pentagon loosely, okay, because it's not just the Pentagon. It's the deep state in general and the dumb state. But the Pentagon has a problem. It cannot control the phenomenon. All it can do is control the narrative. So, and that's what they've been doing. The Pentagon has been feverishly attempting to stay in control of the narrative. So, in regard to what this committee in Congress is attempting to achieve, let's be specific. I think that the next important step in their efforts to get to the bottom of especially the crash retrieval programs, we need whistleblowers from the programs themselves. We need these aerospace contractors who've actually put their hands on the technology, like Bob Lazar type individuals. We need those guys to come forward and to actually begin to describe what these projects are, what they have been recovering, what they have been attempting to achieve in regard to reverse engineering, and what they have in fact achieved. That's the next step. Certainly getting more guys from the intelligence community or from the military would be great, but what we really need now are these contractors to come forward. And if there's any contractors listening to us, I know that having talked to at least one member of the committee, these guys would be very aggressive in protecting any kind of whistleblowers who came forward. And so I think we're going to see that. I think, and I got a gut feeling that we're going to see it pretty soon. We're going to see somebody coming from, aside from maybe some military guys and some more intelligence community guys coming forward, we're going to see somebody from the contracting community, from the aerospace contracting community come forward. Remember that some decades ago, Ben Rich, who was the president of Lockheed Martin, was out there openly talking about how we now have the technology to send ET home. Ben Rich, he was the director or the president of Lockheed Martin, was out there publicly announcing this in certain venues, and so I think that obviously it's very dangerous for these guys. It's more dangerous for the guys that are working with the contractors to come forward, with the private contractors, because one of the revelations that we discovered during the hearing that Grush, one of the things that Grush revealed was that the way that some of these special access programs are being funded is through a misappropriation of funds. In other words, these contracting companies, these aerospace companies, let's say Lockheed Martin to be specific, will give the government a quote, let's say for a new fighter jet, for a new F-118 Hornet, let's say, and they will inflate the price. They'll inflate the charge. So really it may only cost, I don't know, $600 million to build another one of those jets, but they say it costs $1 billion. And so when our government pays them $1 billion per jet, they have $400 million sitting there that they can shave off the top and allocate to these special access programs. I was just quickly checking the math. I might have gotten it wrong. I don't even remember the numbers I threw out there, but you get the point. They have these additional funds that they've inflated that are being directed to the secret access programs. And so that's one of the ways, by the way, that's the least nefarious way, let's say, even though it's very nefarious, because that's a circumvention of Congress. That's a bold-faced lie to Congress, because you're saying in the defense budget, you're saying this is how much money it's costing to build a fighter jet, when that's a lie. It's not costing that much money. That number is inflated, purposely inflated, so that those additional funds, those inflationary funds, can go towards these special access programs. So, and why? So that they can circumvent congressional oversight. And when you circumvent congressional oversight, you are by de facto circumventing the American people, which is treasonous. You can't do that. You can't take our money, tell us this is what you're spending it on, and then inflating those numbers and spending it on something else that we know nothing about. And that is certainly, maybe treasonous is too strong of a word, but it's certainly a slap in the face to Congress. At the very least, it's a great offense to the American people and to Congress, our representatives. And I don't know why I went down that rabbit trail, but the point is that we need some of these private contractors, aerospace contractors, to come forth. I think that's what we're going to see next. And when we see that happen, now you have both private contractors and Navy guys, Navy pilots, intelligence officers. It's going to be very difficult to control the slow drip of disclosure at that point. It's going to start. It's like the faucet's going to open up a little bit more, and it's going to get really interesting really fast.
Timothy, this has been an absolutely fascinating interview. I appreciate you coming on. I hope you'll come back.
Of course.
Let's wrap this up. This is the important question. Do you believe the alien question ties in with Bible prophecy? And how does it tie in with Bible prophecy? Well,
before we get to any kind of prophecy, I think we should just back up and discuss the biblical narrative. I think the operative question is, do extraterrestrials exist within the biblical paradigm? I think that's the base question that we need to answer.
Okay.
And I think we can answer that question by saying unequivocally, yes. Unequivocally. We know that in the book of Job, we read that the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, shouted for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid. Just full stop right there. You have non-human intelligences, sentient beings, the sons of God, very powerful sentient beings who are shouting for joy, not just when mankind is created, but before that, when the foundations of the earth are being laid, whatever that means. So you have and let's put it in these terms, you have an extraterrestrial presence that predates the existence of mankind, unequivocally within the biblical paradigm. There's no argument there. Anyone who wants to make an argument, a case that that's not true, would have to do so outside of the pages of the Bible, because within the biblical text, there are clearly extraterrestrial beings interacting with the human species. Now, extraterrestrial simply means, and let's focus on sentient beings, not amoebas or something. Extraterrestrial, the definition means a being whose provenance, whose origin is not planet Earth. Mm-hmm. That's it. Whose origin is not Earth. Our origin is Earth. We were born here. We are Earth-born. So are the Nephilim, by the way. But we are Earth-born. Our origin is planet Earth. The origin of the angelic race, and I call them very specifically a race. I call them the elder race in my book because they're older than us, clearly, and they constitute a race. So the elder race, these angelic entities, are clearly not from the earth. Their provenance, their origin is not planet Earth. Now, you can quibble about whether their origin is somewhere else within the physical universe or whether it's some sort of an extra dimensional realm or whatever, but it's irrelevant. They are, no matter how you slice this thing, these angelic beings are extraterrestrial. They're not from the earth. Mm-hmm. Again, true. I don't care if they're interdimensional or they're from Jupiter. Makes no difference. They are inescapably extraterrestrial. Okay. And I would add to that they are clearly in possession of advanced technology. Clearly, especially as it pertains to vehicles of conveyance. I would say, even more specifically, that within the biblical narrative, we have examples of these angelic extraterrestrial entities operating advanced aerospace vehicles, what we might call UFOs today. So when I said that earlier in this conversation that there's been an alien presence on planet Earth since the beginning, that's what I mean. And let's define alien. Alien is a little bit more complicated of a term, but I would define alien, this is certainly one of its definitions, especially in the context of this conversation. Any sentient being that is not us is alien to us, is alien to the human species. And to be specific, a non-human entity that has an extraterrestrial province is alien to the human species. So it is accurate to define these angelic entities as alien and extraterrestrial or extraterrestrial. Now, I don't believe that, I don't subscribe to ancient alien, to the ancient alien hypothesis, to ancient astronaut theory. I don't subscribe to that. But I do believe that the basic premise of ancient astronaut theory is true, is biblically accurate, in that mankind has been interacting with extraterrestrial beings since his conception, since the beginning, since the beginning of human civilization, certainly, and furthermore has been influenced by extraterrestrial beings, good and bad. And so you have now a division, obviously, again, operating within the biblical paradigm. If we talk about these angelic beings, by the way, the term angel is intentionally ambiguous in the Bible. But that's why I call them the elder race, because I'm trying to be a little bit more definitive. They're older than us, and this is a civilization, by the way. These aren't just ethereal, non-physical things. This constitutes a civilization. There is an angelic civilization. In fact, I would say very, very confidently that the Bible, this angelic civilization, is described within the biblical narrative as the kingdom of heaven. There's a king, and that king has servants. There's judges, there's courtiers, there's couriers, there's a standing army. One of the more prominent names for God, for Yahweh in the Old Testament is the Lord of armies, the Lord of hosts. And that word host has a militaristic connotation. It means armies. It can be translated as armies. So you have the Lord of armies. When I think it was Jesus, who the angel of the Lord appeared before Joshua, he appeared as a man of war with a sword. He was a warrior. And so, the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. So here's a question, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but this is a question that percolates in my brain. Does the kingdom of heaven have locality within our universe? And I would say it does. I think the universe was created for a purpose. I don't think that the universe was just created for one planet with the human species on. I think there's a whole lot of things going on out there. But the kingdom of heaven is not just a concept. It's a functional kingdom. In fact, earthly kingdoms are supposed to be modeled on the kingdom of heaven. That was the original intention. So the point is that, yes, there is a clear paradigm. The biblical paradigm does accommodate the existence of extraterrestrials. That the existence of extraterrestrials, furthermore, is presumed, not just accommodated within the paradigm, presumed within the paradigm. And I think that is a very logical and important, essential starting point for any Christian who's going to approach the UFO topic. We just, right out of the gates, we need to just accept that extraterrestrials exist. I mean, my God, it's crystal clear. And once I think a lot of Christians can get over that hump, then we can begin to digest some of the more surprising, shocking elements of an extraterrestrial presence, because we're not just talking about angelic beings. And again, I said good and bad. So you have this angelic civilization operating advanced technology. Clearly, that's clearly the case within the biblical narrative. And among this faction, and by the way, this particular faction, I believe we look like them. I think we're the younger sibling in this, that they're the older sibling, we're the younger sibling. I think that ties into the parable of the prodigal son. So when we're dealing with this faction, this angelic faction, we are interacting with, to simplify it, the good guys and the bad guys. And I would say on planet Earth, probably mostly the bad guys, because part of this faction is in a state of abject rebellion against the King of Heaven. So you have this insurrectionary faction that has broken off from the kingdom of heaven, that is at enmity and war with God, but nevertheless are still members of this civilization. In other words, you have the faithful sons of God in heaven, and then you have the rebellious, the defected sons of God, the quote unquote fallen angels on earth. And perhaps elsewhere, and both of those, both sides of that coin are in play in terms of interaction with the human species. So here's a question: is it possible that some of the UFO activity that's been observed over the decades, and I would say as it pertains to this particular faction, the angelic faction, I would say over the millennia, is it possible that some of that UFO activity, some of those craft are being piloted by the good guys, in other words, i.e. by the angels, the good guys.
Oh, I've never even thought about that.
And that a lot of those craft are perhaps being piloted by the bad guys. Okay, so that's one faction, but then you have the grays in the mix. because clearly you have this faction, gray aliens. I think it's indisputable. In fact, Grush is moving in that direction. I think that's what he's going to reveal to these congressmen, specifics about the grays. And so those are certainly the bodies that are being recovered in many of the crash retrievals of the gray aliens. And so you have other factions involved, not just the angelic faction. And so it's a very complicated situation. It's a very complicated universe. And I don't think there's no breach whatsoever in regard to Christian doctrine here. None. There's no breach. The gospel of Christ is not at all altered by the existence of extraterrestrials. The existence of angels does not do damage to the gospel of Christ, and they're extraterrestrial beings. So why would the existence of other extraterrestrials do damage to the gospel of Christ? It doesn't at all. There's no conflict here. The conflict is imaginary. It's an imagined conflict. It doesn't actually exist. So I'm not so concerned. The question in my mind isn't, do these beings exist? Because I'm absolutely unequivocally certain that they do. My question would be in regard to the allegiance of these beings in regard as it pertains to the kingdom of heaven and the king of heaven. So I think we as believers living in this age, we have an opportunity to mature and to advance in the way that we conceptualize the kingdom of heaven and the way that we conceptualize certain events that we read about in the Bible. And I think we should embrace the opportunity. And I think that we should not shirk from this topic, and we should understand that not only does the biblical paradigm accommodate extraterrestrials, UFOs, and the like, but it presumes their existence.
Timothy, I wish we could interview you for 5 straight hours.
We've done it before.
You know.
We have actually. That's true. That's actually a factual statement. Like 5 days in a row or something with Josh Peck. Yeah.
Yeah, when
awesome.
Birthright came out, we did this massive, like 4-part series, and each part was something like 3 hours. I think the whole series was over 8 hours.
Timothy,
That's right. Yeah.
will you come back and do another interview with us sometime?
I certainly will.
Okay, listen, audience, you heard it. I wanted him to agree on air so that we can go back and listen to him say it. Timothy, before we let you go, where can people pick up your book, and also where can they follow you online?
You can get my book on Amazon. You can get it on, I think it's on BarnesandNoble.com. I think it's on Walmart.com. Okay. So you can get it on the major online vendors of books. What was the other question? Where can people find me online? I have a YouTube channel, Timothy Alberino. My handle on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, is the same. It's just at Timothy Alberino. And I have a website, although my website needs some revamping. But I have a website, and you can sign up for my mailing list on my website if you really want to make sure that you don't miss any of the events that I do, or anytime I publish a new video or something, I'll send out an email notification. So sign up for my mailing list.
Well, we are totally out of time. Once again, Timothy, thank you for being on today's program. It was fascinating. You're a fascinating individual. So thanks again, and I can't wait to have you back.
Well, it was my pleasure, and anytime.
We'll see you next week.